So we have a new Star Trek movie coming out in a couple of weeks. Very exciting for a Star Trek fan like me. Star Trek Into Darkness, the second and presumably last Star Trek film directed by J.J. Abrams, who is going off to take over Star Wars after this. And I thought it would be fun between now and when the new film opens on May 17th here in the U.S. to go back and review the previous Star Trek films, sort of take a look back at the Star Trek film franchise up to this point. And then on the 17th, when the new film comes out, I'll review that and I'll post a video about that too. So the first Star Trek motion picture was the cunningly titled Star Trek The Motion Picture, and it came out in 1979. It was a response really to Star Wars. The huge mega theatrical success of Star Wars created this boom of sci-fi adventure material, and it was really because of Star Wars that Star Trek found itself resurrected in such a high-profile way. In a motion picture, there had been plans for a new TV series, but it was really the success of Star Wars that convinced Paramount that this could be and should be a film franchise, and they'd make a lot more money that way. So we have all the original cast back, the first time that we've seen them since the last episode of Star Trek, which was about 10 years before. It's a big budget movie directed by Robert Wise, who is a really, really great filmmaker, a prestige director, and not exactly the guy you would think would be directing a Star Trek movie. And still is probably to this day is still the Star Trek director with the highest pedigree. You know, he's the one with the most the most name recognition and the most artistic cred, I guess you would say, who has directed a Star Trek movie. What I find really interesting about Star Trek The Motion Picture, which I consider it a decent film. I wouldn't call it a great film. I certainly wouldn't call it a really bad film. But what I find interesting about it is its tone. And I think I would call it a lesson for, well, it's a lesson in a couple of things. A lesson for how tone can work to the advantage and the disadvantage of particular material, how certain material has an ideal tone at which it should be presented, and I don't think that Star Trek The Motion Picture presents us with Star Trek at its ideal tone, and also that you should be careful of what your influences are, depending on what material you're working with, because even though it was inspired commercially by Star Wars, Star Trek The Motion Picture aims much more for something like 2001: A Space Odyssey. It takes Star Trek into a far more somber, serious, and self-serious place than it had been previously. In the series, the Star Trek TV series, relatively low budget, very cheesy, not much in terms of effects or makeup, and just the tone of the show was that of an adventure series with some social, political concerns here and there. An adventure series with moments of allegory, we'll say. But the movie wants to be 2001: A Space Odyssey. The movie feels very serious and wants to be taken very seriously. Things move relatively slow. There are all those glamour shots of the outside of the ship the first time we see the new redesigned Enterprise on the big screen. The ship's not doing anything. It's just sitting there in dry dock while the camera just moves around it and sort of drinks it all in. And that's relatively early in the movie. And it really sets a tone and a pace that you don't expect from a Star Trek movie, and one which I would say doesn't really work for Star Trek, because even though it does deal with serious issues and even though it can be used to tell serious stories, overall, Star Trek, I would argue as a longtime fan, is not at its best when it tries to be super serious, especially in terms of its tone and its presentation. And that's a big mistake that I think Star Trek The Motion Picture makes. And that's a mistake that, for the most part, the films that would follow it would not repeat. The Star Trek films after this really found their footing in terms of their tone and in terms of their voice, and didn't make that same mistake, and felt more like Star Trek than Star Trek The Motion Picture does. But those pacing issues and those tonal issues aside, I think overall this is a good movie, and it's an enjoyable movie. There are fun parts to it. It has a curiosity factor because it is not only was it the first Star Trek movie, and it came around after a long dormant period where there was no Star Trek at all, no live action Star Trek for 10 years. And because it is so different from the films that came after it, it kind of stands alone as its own little curiosity. You know, the uniforms look different than they do anywhere else. The look of the ship looks different than it does anywhere else. The characters themselves, when we first meet them, obviously time has passed in the real world for these actors, and time has also apparently passed some indeterminate amount of time for the characters since their last adventure on TV. So everybody's a little older. People have slightly different jobs. We see that Captain Kirk is now Admiral Kirk, and we get the feeling that he hasn't been in space very much lately. He's had kind of a desk job at Starfleet, and Spock has left Starfleet completely, gone back to Vulcan to study Kolinar, to get back into his logic and his religion. Dr. McCoy has left Starfleet completely, has retired. So there's in the first act, there's a lot of there's like a gathering. The characters are coming back together. And that's interesting and that's fun because not only are the characters reintroducing themselves to us as the audience after a long absence, but they're also introducing themselves once again to each other, and that works pretty well, I think. And there are also new characters. There's Perseus Kambata as Aliyah, the helmsman, who is a Deltan, a bald alien with an incredibly strong sexual attraction to the men on the ship. And there's her ex-boyfriend, Decker, who is the new first officer on the ship. Actually, he's supposed to be the new captain, and then Kirk comes back and decides he's going to be the captain, and Decker becomes the first officer. And you might notice that Decker and Aliyah's relationship is very much a forerunner of the Commander Riker, Counselor Troy dynamic on Star Trek The Next Generation. That's one of several elements of Star Trek The Motion Picture that was sort of lifted and used also for Next Generation. Another obvious one would be the theme song. The opening theme song for Next Generation is also the theme song for Star Trek The Motion Picture. It's obvious that this is the first time that Star Trek has had any money to spend, and you can see the money. It's a really well-made, really well-produced, good-looking movie. The sets all look great. The ship, the exteriors, the special effects all look terrific. Even in the original version, they all look really good. And a lot of those special effects, especially when they get outside the ship, when Spock and Kirk take that spacewalk through the V'ger ship, looked a lot of 2001 inspired visuals there. It's very clear that Wise and Roddenberry, the producers of this film, were really going for 2001. And visually it works wonderfully. I have tonal problems with it, as I said, but visually it all looks really good. There's a remastered version on DVD and Blu-ray now with newer special effects, sort of redone special effects, and those all look fine. They look great, but the original special effects still hold up too. If you can get your hands on a version before the remaster, before the redo of the special effects, they all look pretty good. You know, it's all model work and matte paintings and just in-camera type stuff, and it all works. It works. It looks terrific. I can imagine seeing this movie in 1979 and being very impressed with the special effects, and the way the actors were integrated into the special effects. It all looks really, really good. It's really well done. And even though the story they choose to tell in Star Trek: The Motion Picture does, I feel, drag it a little too far away from what Star Trek does best, there are elements of this story and things that they do in Star Trek: The Motion Picture that they don't do in the later films or the later television series that I kind of wish that they would more often. And the biggest one is the revelation that V'ger is in fact Voyager. It is a NASA space probe that has been sent off into space, that was sent off into space by us in the 20th century and was eventually lost and has returned now as this sentient artificial life form that has come back to find its creator, the people of Earth. And of course, it's not Voyager, one of the actual Voyagers that we made, Voyager 1 or 2. It's called Voyager 6, but it's the same model, it's the same program. It's a fictional version of the real Voyager spacecraft. And that's really cool. That's one of my favorite parts of the movie, because it connects the Star Trek universe, it connects the events that are happening with these characters with the real-life contemporary world and the real-life contemporary space program, because Voyager was a real thing, and the Voyager that you see in Star Trek the Motion Picture looks just like the real Voyager. Then there's Captain Kirk touching Voyager, and it's a really cool moment. And it's a moment where that fictional, fantastic Star Trek world comes into contact with our real world. And I like it for that reason, and I also like it because it reminds me, and it reminds all of us as we watch the film, that these characters are astronauts. You know, they're space explorers. They're people, mostly human beings still at this point. Not very many aliens. Mostly humans who have left Earth and are exploring the universe. And that's something that Star Trek sometimes forgets. It gets too caught up in the mythology and the adventure and the aliens and it forgets that at its heart it's a story about astronauts. It's a story about people who have left the Earth and are exploring space. And that really resonates with me. That's really powerful. I think one of the things that makes Star Trek work when it works at its absolute best is when it allows us, or it reminds us, that Star Trek should be a space adventure. It should be an adventure story with astronauts as the heroes, instead of detectives or cowboys or what have you. It should be an adventure story with astronauts. And there's an element of that in Star Trek the Motion Picture because of that connection to Voyager. And I really like that. And even though there are other films that come later in the series that are much, much better than Star Trek the Motion Picture, not many of them have that same tethering to astronauts, to NASA, to the space program, to the real-life space program that Star Trek the Motion Picture has. And that is one thing about that first Star Trek movie that I truly, truly appreciate and don't really find as much. You find it here and there in later films, but you don't find it as much or as strongly as you do in Star Trek the Motion Picture. And that may be my favorite part about it.